Prince of Persia: Sands of Time was a great game, but the obnoxious combat made getting through certain parts of the game a chore. Still, the good aspects of the game shone through, it was a success, and ended up having 2 sequels, Warrior Within and Two Thrones. Fun fact, I mistakenly believed that Two Thrones was the second game and Warrior Within was the third game, when it's really the other way around. As a result, I ended up playing Two Thrones immediately after Sands of Time, and since each game takes place after the events of the previous game, I was rather confused as to what was going on. Eventually I figured it out though. Sands of Time was a great game that had a few issues. So, do the sequels iron out these issues and deliver something even better? Well, not really. The core gameplay is still really good, and the platforming and trap avoiding is as satisfying as ever, but the combat is still annoying. The first game's problem was that it kept spawning wave after wave after wave of enemies at you, which made the combat sections drag on for way too long. Warrior Within doesn't have this particular problem, as the number of enemies it throws at you is much more reasonable. Unfortunately, it messed up, because while it doesn't spawn wave after wave, for some reason most of the enemies have absurd amounts of health, and so the combat still ends up dragging on for way too long. Also, while the combat in Sands of Time was obnoxious, at least the game had distinct sections, where some parts of the game were designated platforming sections, and other parts of the game were designated combat sections. It was easy to tell where one ended and the other began, and for the most part they stayed out of each other's way, and the combat didn't interfere with the platforming. Again, for the most part. Sadly, this is not the case with Warrior Within, where there is no distinct separation between the platforming and the combat will constantly interrupt the platforming, which is a shame because the platforming is still really good, but it's ruined when you have to stop every few yards and kill several more grunts who stand in your way. The combat mechanics in Two Thrones are better than the combat mechanics in both Sands of Time and Warrior Within, and I especially appreciate the game providing stealth kills, which make taking out enemies much easier. But while the combat is the best in the third game, it's still annoying. If you're 1 nanosecond off with the stealth kill, it will fail, and the combat still interrupts the platforming much more than it should. And this is what I find so puzzling about all 3 of the Sands of Time games, their insistence on placing so much time and effort on the combat, which just ends up hurting the games. In the original Prince of Persia, the focus of the game was the puzzle platforming and trap avoidance, and the sword fights were an occasional aside to break up the platforming every once in a while. They were never intended to be the main focus of the game. The platforming in the Sands of Time games is really good, and nicely translates the core ideas of the original into a 3D space. This is what the game should have been all about, with the combat being an occasional aside here and there. But instead, the games put so much emphasis on the combat, when that's clearly not what they're good at. If I wanted a game that's all about combat, I just replay Devil May Cry 3. But when it comes to a Prince of Persia game, I want tricky but satisfying platforming, not tedious and boring combat. While the combat is still a big issue in the sequels to Sands of Time, it's not the only one. Another major problem is the story. Now, on paper, Warrior Within's story sounds perfectly fine. Taking place several years after the events of Sands of Time, the prince finds that in opening the Sands of Time, he has drawn the attention of the Dahaka, the mysterious and deadly guardian of the timeline. Despite the fact that he fixed things by the end of the first game, he was supposed to have died, and so the Dahaka will continue to hunt him until he meets his fate. Desperate to try to avoid his seemingly inescapable death, the prince sets sail to the Island of Time, the place where the Sands of Time were originally created. He intends to travel back in time and prevent the sands from being created in the first place, and thus hopes that this will mean that the Dahaka will no longer have a reason to hunt him. That doesn't really sound like a good idea. If you alter the past like that, then that will alter the present and the future, and the timeline you came from will cease to exist, and potentially so will you. That's the trouble with time travel. But time travel shenanigans aside, the story is good and has some nice twists and turns along the way. However, the overall atmosphere of the game feels a bit off. While the first game wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows, it was still a fairly lighthearted adventure that didn't take itself too seriously. This game, though, is much darker and grimmer. And I don't mind the game being darker, it's just that the tonal shift makes it feel like it takes place in a completely different universe than the first game, which is incredibly jarring. I mean, listen to the music that plays during the combat in each game, and tell me if you don't notice a rather abrupt change in style. It's a bit odd, right? Also, this may be a nitpick, but when it comes to what the female characters are wearing... what is this? It's obvious that the only reason she's dressed like this is to provide eye candy. But there's a few problems with this. First of all, I don't play video games to satisfy my libido, I have other outlets for that. But more importantly, what she's wearing isn't sexy, it's just stupid. Yes, the attire of Farah in the first game was a bit revealing, but she was a captured princess who was suddenly and unexpectedly thrust into a dangerous situation with no time to prepare, so it makes sense. And while the female sand zombies wore what were pretty much ancient bikinis, well, they're zombies. They're not exactly known for their intelligence or their tactical prowess. But this character is supposed to be a soldier going after an enemy, so why the hell isn't she wearing armor that actually protects her? The only way this would make any kind of sense is if she was like Lust from FMA, where she's pretty much indestructible and her attire doesn't really matter one way or the other. But as we see fairly early on in the game, that clearly isn't the case. And unfortunately it's not just her, as the other female characters in the game also wear similarly impractical and utterly ridiculous clothing. It's rather bizarre because on the one hand the game is trying to go for a darker, maturer tone, and thus is trying to be taken more seriously, but then it throws in this distracting element that is completely silly and makes it harder to take the game seriously. If you can look past the abrupt tonal change and the silliness of the female characters' outfits, the story is actually fairly well told, with good pacing and some nice twists and reveals along the way. But I couldn't blame you if the distracting elements kept you from getting into the game. Even when it first came out, the tonal shift was heavily criticized. When it comes to Two Thrones, the overall tone and atmosphere feels like it's somewhere in between the first two games, being not quite as lighthearted as Sands of Time, but not quite as grim as Warrior Within. It opens with the prince returning to his home city of Babylon. This confused me for a bit, but after doing some googling I found that there was indeed a period of time when Babylon was the capital of Persia. Huh, the more you know. Anyways, the prince returns with a lady friend he found during the events of Warrior Within, only to find his beloved city in flames and under attack by unknown invaders. His boat is destroyed, his lady friend is captured, and he must venture through the chaotic city in order to rescue her and find out what happened to his home while he was gone. As is inferred by the player and the prince fairly early on in the game, and is soon confirmed, the city is under attack because of the time-traveling shenanigans the prince was doing in the previous game. By altering history, the prince caused this tragic turn of events. So congratulations, you saved your life by screwing everyone else over, including yourself.
Not a great plan.
I actually don't mind this plot development, as it is a good twist and addresses the consequences of meddling with time. But then the game introduces some plot developments that I didn't care for. Guess who the big bad guy is? That's right, it's the evil vizier from the first game. Only this time he succeeds in becoming immortal, so all the relatable humanity that made him an above-average villain in the first game is gone. And guess who shows back up to help the prince on his journey? That's right, Farah from the first game. Only, because of the time-traveling shenanigans, they've technically never met, and she doesn't remember him. And now they get to rebuild their companionship and possibly romance anew, right? Well, sort of. The problem is that it's not done nearly as well as it was the first time. In the first game, their banter worked because you could see how the characters grew as the story unfolded, and most importantly, their conversation sounded like how actual people talk. In Two Thrones, though, it feels like they're trying way too hard to recreate the chemistry these characters had in the first game, and the conversations end up sounding awkward, forced, and stiff. All of that aside, though, the game ends up feeling like a huge step backwards when it comes to the narrative. While it had some problems, the story in Warrior Within was a different story from Sands of Time, and introduced new ideas and characters that helped make its narrative unique. By bringing back characters from the first game and having them do more or less the same thing again, Two Thrones ends up constantly reminding you of the first game and how much better the story in that game was. There are a few interesting curveballs the story has, such as a dark alter ego the prince develops, but overall the story isn't all that great. For all my criticisms, I can say that Warrior Within and Two Thrones are both good games, but overall Sands of Time is still the best of the three. If Sands of Time had the combat mechanics of Two Thrones, I probably would have given it a 10 out of 10. But unfortunately it doesn't, and both Warrior Within and Two Thrones fail to surpass Sands of Time, not only because they didn't fix what was wrong with Sands of Time, but because they also added new flaws. In the end, Prince of Persia Sands of Time is a great game, and you should definitely play it if you haven't already. If you like it, then Warrior Within and Two Thrones are also very much worth your time. But if you don't like it, then the other games are a definite skip. My final score for Warrior Within and Two Thrones is a 7 out of 10 for each. I had fun with them, but unfortunately they also annoyed and frustrated me a fair amount. So what do you think? Have you played the Sands of Time trilogy? What are your thoughts on these games, and which one is your favorite? Whatever you think, be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you like what I do, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.